To everybody. It's very happy to have you here. And this is the second day of this major program of the Vienna Humanities Festivals that we started 5 years ago together with the Wien Museum. So I'm very happy that Matti is here. This is also quite important session for us, and I'm going to tell why. Normally on the festivals, you invite two types of people. People that everybody knows, and this is why they go to the festivals, but also people that you want people to know and probably they don't know. And ANER BARZILAY, the person whom I'll have the pleasure to moderate today, goes for the second category. You don't feel guilty if you don't know him yet, because he just defended his PhD with the Yale University 2 years ago?
3 years now.
3 years ago. He's teaching now with NYU in Shanghai, but he was a fellow in IWM. And I do believe, not only for me, but also for my other colleagues in the Institute, he was one of the very interesting voices that we have. Not simply a person speaking about what he's doing his research on, and he has been working on Foucault and the idea of the historicism, but also very much about his general way to conceptualizing what is happening with the time in which we are living. So this is why we decided to invite him to be one of the speakers at this festival, and I hope that he's going to impress you in the way he impressed us. I want to start with something, because when we came with this title, The Age of Uncertainty, and probably we have a different idea of what we meant. Because uncertainty is not simply the fact that people feel confused. The problem was, when was the age of certainty? And what it meant, and what is basically the type of a situation in which we find ourselves, to discuss it. Because for me, this is kind of a natural way to introduce a topic of the crisis of historicism, and then I'll try to ask you much more about the nature of this crisis. So, ANER, please.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for the lovely introduction. And I would like to start off by thanking Desi Gavrilova for orchestrating this event and all the IWM staff who made today possible. So I would like to begin by saying a couple of things. First of all, this talk today about the decline of historicity is tied to my current project that looks basically at what I considered an epochal shift that occurs around the 1970s. Okay, so now I'm putting on my historian's hat and saying it's time to periodize the age of uncertainty and say when it begins. I'm now going to give you a teaser. It begins around 1970. But I will also now put on my philosopher cap, and that means I will define, first of all, what are my premises and what I actually don't want to talk about. So as Ivan said, there is a notion of uncertainty that I would like to call maybe the psychological, the biological, the anthropological, which affects us as human beings, which we as human beings, our psyche, we are programmed to be uncertain. But human beings have been on this planet for over 200,000 years, and I'm sure that our ancestors were uncertain whether rain will come, whether they will be sick, whether a bear will prey on their kin. But this doesn't tell us basically why we are here today. I would like to focus on the notion of uncertainty, and certainty as something that is intimately tied to the Western philosophy, to the development of Western science, and basically look at the history of Western metaphysics that explain why we are here today through the question of uncertainty and certainty. So for this, we have to go, first of all, to Plato. For Greek philosophy and most, for Plato, the problem is as follows. How can we be certain that we know things? How can we justify our knowledge, and how can we know that it is true? Ivan and I will look at the same painting. He will see a rabbit. I will see a duck. Which one is it? Sometimes, you know, I can taste something. I drink a bottle of Coke and it has a certain taste. I have COVID, it tastes completely different. The Coke itself, the world, the object has not changed, but our subjective perceptive has. Now, Plato realized that there is a kind of knowledge that is always true, always objective. And this was the knowledge of math and geometry, what he called ideal knowledge. It doesn't matter if we are now or here in Vienna or in Timbuktu 2,000 years ago or 2,000 years from now, 2 plus 2 equals 4. The sum of angles of a triangle will always be 180. Math and geometry is a kind of trans-historical validity that is objective, it's universal, and it will always remain true. Now, the one problem that the Greeks had, and what guided Plato, was basically the idea that, you know what, there aren't any perfect triangles in the world. Numbers are ideal construct. So where did these things come from? How can we reason using logic and rationality if those entities are not from this world? And the answer he gave was that they all come from another reality. They come from a transcendent, eternal, unchanging world of ideas, and we can have a glimpse into this world, but ultimately the world that we live in is but a waiting room on the road to eternity. And we can see how this notion of devaluing this world in favor of sort of a universal, capital T, objective truth that is unchanging has been taken over by Christian theology. In that sense, it's important to remember when Friedrich Nietzsche said, Socrates and Jesus Christ are one and the same. The devaluation of this world, the idea that this world is only a transitory station on the way to an eternal, unchanging reality, this was the promise of Christianity, the afterlife. And we can understand why science, basically, that flourished, I would say, in the Greek, in the ancient Greek world, was sort of, had been put on ice for about a period of 2,000 years. From Plato to the Renaissance and the Reformation, it's a period of roughly 2,000 years. And we can fathom why. It's not because people grew stupid, but if you took this mode of thinking about truth as a transcendent concept, why would you deal with this world if you can contemplate the eternal through theology? Now, so where does the age of certainty begin? The age of certainty begins in modernity with a certain change. Early modernity, and I don't have time to get into this, but I mentioned two important events, the Renaissance and the Reformation, basically transform the way that philosophy considers the world. This is what the historian and philosopher of science, Alexandre Poiret, called the transformation from a closed world into an infinite universe. People begin to observe the world, and they try to explain it through using the concept of infinity. And the first protagonist that embodies both the philosophical rise of certainty and also the natural science aspect of it is, of course, René Descartes. Any first-year student of philosophy will tell you modern philosophy begins with Descartes. Why? Because the course Introduction to Modern Philosophy begins with Descartes.
Only in French schools.
No, like also in Tel Aviv schools and others. But the point is that Descartes says, you know what? I want to begin with myself. I want to know how I can account for my knowledge. And for me to account for my knowledge of the world, it means that I have to cast radical doubt on everything. And what Descartes comes with is the idea that he can only, first of all, ground knowledge on his own existence. But nevertheless, the model for Descartes, for his critical method, the armament that he's using is what he calls clear and distinct ideas. And clear and distinct ideas still take the mode of Plato. It's geometrical statements, it's mathematical statements, the laws of logical contradiction. So things that appear clear and distinct to my mind's eye still take on the form of math. Now, as much as Descartes took on this idea of grounding certainty on subjectivity, he still required God to give them the world. There is no science for Descartes without the concept of God, and God is still very much alive and well in that system. Also, the project of Descartes was one of explaining natural science, creating physics that apply mathematical formula to make sense of the world, to basically articulate what are the eternal laws that govern this world. It's no longer a question of how we can get to the afterlife and contemplate the eternal, but using the eternal practically in this world to explain things, to make predictions. But neither for Descartes nor for his follower and challenger somehow, Isaac Newton, this project of generating and articulating the mathematical principles of natural science denied God. On the contrary, God was always lurking still in the background, and God was representing and guaranteeing the concept of infinity, mathematical infinity, which basically was the basics of early modern physics. So, whereas early modern physics sidelined God, it still retains a certain reliance on it.
But ANER, does it simply mean that it was the death of God that is the age of uncertainty?
Absolutely, and this is what I want to get to. Where does historicity arise, and where do we begin to use history and certainty together? What happened was that some 200 years ago, in the end of the 18th century, God is no longer having this role in philosophy. With Kant, the French Revolution, people begin to think that, no, truth is something that is only generated by human beings. There is no outside. It comes only from this world. And this means, if truth is not generated from an outside, if it's only from here, how can we account for it? And for this, if truth has become tied to the problem of what is the truth of humanity, then humanity goes back to the past in order to account for it. How come we got to the truth? And this is in many ways the project that is best embodied by Hegel's philosophy of saying, oh, we are now in a humanist age, we can know things about the world is this object, but how do we know that what we know will always be true? And for that, history calls and rushes into this metaphysical void that God, the death of God left us. The death of God not just as a religious event, but in the order of knowledge and in the order of science. And so we begin to see, first of all, that history becomes a science, right? Until the 19th century, history is a pastime for the elites. It's a literary genre. It's not a form of science. In modernity, we begin to see, first of all, we have history professors. We see history becoming a completely transformative force in the development of 19th century science. So whether we think about Darwin, evolutionary theory, whether we think about Marx's political economy, nationalism, liberalism, economy, all of these sciences were basically resting and utilizing this new thing that emerged, which is historicity. And what does historicity basically, modern historicity, entails? It's a uniquely modern consciousness of time that forces us to question what is the present moment. It's an idea that something completely new could emerge and arise. I think this concept is well encapsulated in the German term for modernity as Neuzeit. It's a new time. The idea that the present that we live in is caught between two vectors, one leading to the past. We look to the past to orient ourselves, but we orient ourselves with another vector that is headed towards the future. So when Immanuel Kant claims, what is enlightenment? He's basically asking, what is today? And what does today mean towards the future, and how does it mean so in relation to the past? So I just want to define this modern historicity as something that is completely tied to the notion of modernity as we perceive it. A modernity that no longer relies on the order of knowledge, on some sort of theology, that has a clear subject-object distinction. Humanity is the subject, nature is the object, and the link that allows us to basically account for our own knowledge cannot come from the outside, but can only be justified by resorting to history.
But here's my question, because I'm very much buying this, but what really interests me about the current situation is the following. You said history replaced God. And when history replaced God, the past, the present, and the future are very well defined and very distinctive. What I see in the current debates are two things going in a different direction that in a certain way worries me, and this is at least my understanding of crisis of historicism. On one level, what you're going to see, for example, very much in the United States, all over Europe, is the tendency to treat all the people that have been living in the world as our contemporaries. Basically, we're judging Jefferson through the moral perspective that we have today. He had slaves. And you're decontextualizing, so in a certain way, everybody is our contemporary. So the past is disappearing, it is very different. In a certain way, you are saying that I don't see any reason anymore to judge person in the context of their own times. And then in the future, in a certain way, you have totally extreme situation in which President Putin is writing an essay about why the Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, and he basically claims that he has found in the archives that they are the same people 200 years ago. As a result of it, it cannot be different. So in a certain way, they are the same people. And this is why you can basically go and remind them by violence that they're the same people. So suddenly what I see is that basically the past and the future, strangely enough, are disappearing in one at the same time, probably in different places. And I'm interested where you stand on this, because if this is true, the famous title of Frank Fukuyama's book, The End of History, is going to have a totally different meaning. It is not that we are kind of arrived at the destination, the final destination, but suddenly history stopped to matter. History was incapable anymore to replace God as the way to organize our lives. Is this part of the crisis of historicism?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think that just to touch upon Francis Fukuyama, it's much more helpful to look at Fukuyama's thesis as something that maybe anticipates the end of historicity rather than the end of history, which as a thesis I don't think holds water. But this brings me to the 1970, and I really want to look at this 1970 as an epochal shift, a moment that basically all these big meta-narratives, these huge theories of modernity, the belief in historical progress, that humanity, can just go on through rationality and move to the future, comes to a halt, comes to a certain crisis, a legitimation crisis. And this is obviously tied to the events of 1968, but not only. I think that there are four different aspects that I would like us to discuss. Yeah. One is the philosophical, the other is the political, then we have the economical, and lastly the ecological. I think they are all tied together, they are interrelated, and they all touch upon this point of historicity. So first of all, in terms of a philosophical occurrence that happens at the time, we need to think of the thought of 1968, the failure of a global 1968. 68 solidifies what we now come to term as postmodernism, which denies the authority, first of all, of the subject. Human subjectivity as an authority. It questions the meta-narrative of history itself having a meaning. And what it basically creates as a result is a sort of divorce between the humanities and the natural sciences that I don't think that we have right now. History before in Marxism is perhaps taken as a science. Now it becomes literature. Philosophy becomes literature. History depends who's speaking, who is the one writing the history. There is no universalizing, grounding arc. Secondly, this is tied obviously as a political consequence. And this is something else that emerges internally also within May 68, and that is the rise of identity politics. Because we no longer have a universal common denominator, we begin to think in terms of particular identities. You see it even in Paris, in the May 68 events, where you have different factions, and they cannot really unite against a universal agenda. They're all pulling in different directions. Now, the failure of May 68 is also tied, obviously, to a much more important, I would say, event in the philosophy of history, and this is basically disenchantment with Marxism and the Soviet Union. This is where Solzhenitsyn's, Gulag book comes out, where people become disenchanted with Stalin and with Marxism, and there is no longer a way of sort of holding the dialectic that basically ruled the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. This is essentially the beginning of the script of Fukuyama. There is no dialectic moving history forward because the Soviet Union is no longer an alternative. Therefore, we only have one reigning philosophy of history, which is that of liberal capitalism. But from an economic perspective, this is also the period, exactly around 1970, where this idea of post-war growth that was all over, that basically determined Europe for 30 years, the Wirtschaftswunder, comes to a halt. It's the end of the Bretton Woods order in 1970. It's the beginning of the oil crisis, which basically brings to us, brings to us oil as the most important geopolitical factor that still very much shapes the world today. Energy will now become the crux of what determines the world order, by and large. And from a political standpoint, we see that we have basically no orientation, historical orientation left. So what is left of the left? People begin to think in terms of identity. They very much look back towards history, but they don't look to the future. This is what defines modern historicity. We look at the present as something that guides us towards the future. This is completely gone. The political right is equally bereft of it. Putin can write, treatises about the past, but it has no vision, no future vision and no alternative. If we think, people now say, oh, Meloni in Italy, this is the rise of fascism anew. There is nothing modern in this view. Both modern nationalism and fascism were modernist movements through and through. They conceived of, first of all, they were extremely scientific, they looked towards the past, and they wanted to create a new human being, a new society to lead to the future. Look at the architecture of Mussolini or of Hitler. This is not some sort of atavism, a way of looking at the past in a romantic way. What we see in Europe right now has nothing of it. All that the authoritarian right has is basically to look nostalgically towards the recent past.
I'll go even further, because in a certain way, both fascism and communism in 1920s and 30s, they were pedagogical projects. They didn't like the people in the way they were. They wanted to create a new people, very different idea of what is a new people. But all of them have been revolutionary projects. If you see the populist movements today, their major messages to the people, I like you in the way you are. The promise is, I'm not going to change you. This is totally opposite, both to the... Fascism was perceiving itself as a revolution. Communism, for sure, was perceiving itself as a revolution. And for me, this kind of a disappearance of the future is interesting, because people are forgetting something about Frank Fukuyama's book. And not the article, but the book was called The End of History and the Last Man. So the end of history kind of slightly became irrelevant, but the last man, in my view, start to be interesting, because if you see some of the major political movements today, they behaved as the last man. On one level, on the right, you're going to see, because of the demographic panics and others, the idea that we're the last man, or probably this is the last elections. If you go and listen to President Trump in 2016, his major message to the Republicans was, if we're not going to win today, tomorrow the Democrats are going to give the rights to the migrants to vote, and you're never going to win anyway. So this is the last man, the last elections. And then you go to the climate activists on the left. And they also believe that we're the last man because the earth is not going to be sustained. So I'm very much interested how the idea of the crisis of historicism, in a certain way, instead of having the left and the right vision of the future as a project, ended up with a kind of a left and right weak type of apocalyptic mind. In a certain one on the left very much worried about the end of life, and one on the right about the end of our way of life. But in a certain way, they share this idea that we are the last man. In a certain way, interestingly enough, of course, with a very different moral imperatives. On the left, the idea is it moral to have children in a world which is so much crowded, and on the right, is it moral to have less than 5 children when your basically nation is so much? So I'm very much interested in this kind of political story, because coming from where I'm coming in political science, the biggest story is that democracy cannot function if you do not have a kind of a positive perspective on the future. Because the future is the place where all the problems are solved. And from this point of view, my question also is there a place in the world where you believe that historicism is still not in crisis?
Okay, yes. But I will start by saying that I think you're absolutely right. I mean, people obviously have notions about the future, right? But the idea that historicity made was that, no, the future will be something new. The idea that there will be a fundamental change. But what do we have right now? What is the capitalist view of historicity? It's been replaced by what I call like the Warren Buffett view of historicity. You look at the SP 500 and you see that it grows and you say, oh, there's change, we're going somewhere. Or the Steve Jobs variety. There's a new iPhone, there's progress, we're going places, but there's no fundamental change, right? We are caught and locked inside, this eternal present. History is not really considering, and to touch the climate point, if we take this notion of capitalism and the kind of idea of growth that it demands, basically it says, oh, if we want a healthy growth of GDP, we need 2 to 3% annually. This means effectively that every 20 years, the economy will double itself in size. This is completely unsustainable. Not from just an economical level, this is from a planetary level unsustainable. The projections are that by 2050, the planet will have 10 billion human beings. Now we have books about, a recent book came out called An Inconvenient Apocalypse by people who understand this earth studies scientists, that they say, listen, the planet can only support in its current form 2 billion people. There will be grave consequences to the fact that this planet basically cannot support 8 billion people in 20 years. This is something that we need to begin to think about. Now, part of the reason why we are failing in thinking about these things together is what I said before about postmodernism. There has been a divorce between earth science studies, which basically emerged also in this moment of the 70s. This was one of the good results of the Cold War space race. Because of all the satellites and the new understanding of the planet, we have a better understanding of geology, of meteorology, and the concepts that we now think about the world in terms of global warming or even the hole in the ozone layer were only made possible by these sciences that emerged in the 70s. But philosophy and these sciences have nothing to say to one another. And so, as much as we think that politically we live in an age of uncertainty, we actually live in an age of certainty, of certain climate disaster, which we are not really aware of because there is no dialogue taking place between those people who are actually doing the calculations and showing us what basically we need to act upon, but there is a complete miscommunication between them. So we sit here talking about this debate between the left and the right, which both are dealing, as I said, in a non-historical manner about the future. And to answer finally your question, I believe that there is still one government in the world that still retains a form of historicity, and that is China. China, for a whole host of reasons, because it's still, their version of Confucian Marxism is still very much tied to this notion of the philosophy of history. They constantly look backwards as they're looking forward into the future, and I think that one of the best examples of it is what Xi Jinping did a few years ago in his climate agenda. The entire tone that was in Kyoto and in Paris between the developed countries and then the developing countries, China and India, was still with the notion of resentment of post-colonialism. You in the West, you had your chance to modernize in the 19th century, you polluted the planet, nobody told you anything. Now it's our turn, we want to drive SUVs, we want to build our country, so let us be. We're not going to take it from you. But we see when Xi Jinping says, I want China to be carbon-free in terms of emissions by 2050, that he's forsaking this notion of resentment in favor of a higher authority. And this is because he takes science seriously. And he realizes that for him as the leader of his country, there is no way you can move China forward, you cannot support its inhabitants if you don't do something about it.
But here's the interesting question, and I agree, by the way, there was a study that was done by St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and saying that the young Europeans, it was done 2 or 3 years ago, that young Europeans, which are younger than 30, believe that when it comes to climate change, authoritarian regimes are much more effective than the democratic regimes. And here's my story. The climate and this Chinese perspective of climate is the biggest justification of a total social control. I'm so much worried about the future of the Earth that I cannot take care about the individual preferences of the citizens in my own country. In the way before, kind of, communism was a positive utopia, which was controlling people but promising them how well they're going to live in a different world. Suddenly, you basically come with the idea of the catastrophic future, which is climate, which basically can justify any type of social policies of a total social control, because I'm not going to allow this and that and this and that, because otherwise, in a strange way, the life is going to end up. And I find this kind of very interesting, because this idea of the future and how the future is appearing, disappearing, coming from where I'm coming, I'm in political science, much more international relations, there is one thing that worries me very much. People now talk about the return of the Cold War. And to be honest, many people are saying this is the way we're going back to the idea of certainty, because we used to know how it was, and particularly from the Western point of view, there is one thing that is very good about the Cold War, is that the West prevailed. But the problem about the Cold War was that Cold War was a clash between two optimists. Both communists and the liberal West believed that future is on their side. The West believed that communist system cannot survive because of the economic and military weakness. And if you really believed in Marxism, and many of these people believed in Marxism, in a certain way, one of the things that I like most about Kotkin's biography of Stalin is to try to see that we talk all the time about as if he's only interested in power, but any time when he does not know what to do, he was going to reread Lenin and Marx, believing that this is, they're going to tell him. Because anyway, he comes from the seminary, so believes in book. And from this point of view, this was optimism. When you have a clash of two optimists, the risk of a war is much more lower. If I believe that tomorrow I'm going to be in a stronger position than today, I'm not going to start a war with you, because time is on my side. And both kind of protagonists of the Cold War believe this. I don't believe that President Putin believes that time is on his side. In a certain way, he went to Ukraine exactly because he believes that probably this is the last moment when he will do it. Tomorrow is going to be more difficult. So this is why I'm very much interested how, and I very much share your idea that the crisis of historicity is also changing very much how actually politics works. In a certain way, this dimension of the future, if I'm not wrong, but I could be wrong. In Chinese idea of space, I remember that future was something behind our back.
Yeah.
What is in front of us is the past, because this is what we see. But in a certain way, now both future and the past are changing places all the time. This is kind of basically they're running around us. And here's my story. How you're producing a sense of legitimacy in the world you're talking about. In this kind of a world in which historicism is in crisis, how you can produce legitimacy?
I think this is a very important question. I mean, just to touch upon sort of the image that you give and about what is optimism. I mean, I think this is the point, right? I mean, whether the liberal West or the Soviet Marxism, they believed in the future, right? They believed in progress. They believed we're going somewhere. Now, to use the Chinese image that you say of us going to the future with our backs turned to it, you know, which is also that image that Walter Benjamin gives to history. What does he say? What is this wind that is blowing us towards the future? This is what we call this wind progress. And this is precisely what we don't have right now, correct? So we are just standing, as you said before, with our back to the future, and then we're basically judging what happened before us according to our standards right now that we don't even try to justify according to history, right? So if we take the perspective, and I don't want to belittle, you know, identity politics and the way that we look at the past and try to sort of weed, you know, evil from it, but if we now come to the position where we say that essentially Hitler and Winston Churchill are on the same level, because what Churchill did to the Indians is the same as Hitler, then I think we forgot something that is absolutely radical about it. Now, where do I see this crisis of historicity going? I think this is what I said about the rise of ecological science and earth science studies that are basically forcing us to kind of have a dialogue again between the humanities and philosophy. Because what happened now is that we discovered that the modernist premise that guides this progress through history, whether to control people and states, etc., is this subject-object divide of modernity. We, humanity, we are the historical agent, and nature is just there to be rationally organized, value extracted, etc. But what ecology tells us today is that the Earth, the planet, Earth, has a subjectivity of its own. It's no longer just we humans are the subject and Earth there is passive. We are now discovering, with the concept of the Anthropocene and such, that the planet itself has a subjectivity. So what we now need more than ever is a way to tie the old humanist story of human history with a new concept of natural history. We need to think these two subjectivities together, because the main problem we're facing, and I'm sorry, I don't think that it's, it's really a cakewalk, what we see in the Ukraine and in Putin's Russia and social control compared to the dilemmas that we will have to face in 20 or 30 years. I think that it is clear to all of us, and we see it with every coming year, that this crisis is very much felt, and I think that the only way to do something about it is to flip the record from this thing that we've been listening to since the 1970s of uncertainty through the decline of historicity, and discover, no, there is actually a sense of certainty that is very much with us. And this is what we know about the planet today and the way that it could sustain us, essentially.
With this level of certainty, I'll go to the public for the last 2 years. It could be quite scaring certainty, because if some of these calculations are right, in the year 2070, 900 million people are going to be physically unable to live where they're living now. So listen, you can always question any type of calculations like this, but this is the interesting idea of certainty that you're talking about. And Matti.
Yeah, no, I mean, we live in dystopian times, and I mean, something that I wrestle with, oh, thank you. We live in dystopian times, and something I wrestle with all the time, something that seems, globally trivial, like a city museum, is what can we as humanists do? Now, when I listen to you, Ivan, you're one of the few people who can possibly make sense of a seeming madman, and you're one of the people who uses sort of classic humanities concepts to try to make sense on some level of analytic plausibility what's going on. What I hear you guys saying beyond that, though, leaves me quite despondent over any role in the humanities. I mean, the fact that Earth scientists are, warning us now for decades, and the fact that we finally take it seriously, honestly, what is the role that you actually see for the humanities in that task, other than sort of 11th thesis, let's just try to avert the horror?
I think this is a great question. I think that there's actually a lot. If you look at the development of modern philosophy, as I said, you see that philosophy always worked side by side, right? We have, first of all, philosophy working with physics, then changing towards taking biology, which obviously was, the main metaphor, until, I would say, the 70s. But what happened to this divorce right now is that what we have is some, humanities following chasing the coattails of natural science. But what you see natural scientists are saying, we don't have the instruments to actually get our ideas across. We don't have the way to convince people. We don't have a way to turn it into a political story. And this is where I think that intellectuals and the humanities enter, precisely as a way of taking these complex ideas and making them accessible and turning them into a currency, a political currency that people can then, work through and shape the world with. This is something that I don't think that we should give up and just say, oh, let just the natural science do what they do, because you humanities have failed us and are just giving us relativism instead of giving us any guidelines.
I very much agree. Because there is one thing that really strikes me personally. We are so much used to answer a certain type of questions that even when the situation is coming back, we're trying simply to rephrase them, but in the same type of questions. I'm just going to give you one example. I was talking to a head of a big bank, and this guy, in fact, big Russian bank, just to understand why it comes. And they said, listen, we have a problem with personnel, the level of corruption is quite high, so we came with an algorithm, basically, artificial intelligence system that is going to judge the trustworthiness of an individual face, and every loan which is less personal loan, less than $30,000, is going to be decided by this algorithm. Listen, economically it makes a lot of sense. If you're really afraid of high level of corruption and this and that, but here comes the story which kind of political scientist of me cannot not ask. Imagine that you're going for a loan, and you're asking for a loan and they're not giving you a loan. And I know what is going to happen. I'm going back home and I'm saying to my wife, I saw this idiot, I was so unlucky. If it was a different person, probably I could have convinced that I could get the loan. But if it is going to be the algorithm which is telling you you cannot get the loan, then the idea of the system stopped to be a metaphor anymore. Because we are saying people are kind of fighting the system, but the system normally was a metaphor. And now the system is the system. The system is algorithm. You cannot negotiate with this. You cannot bribe it. You cannot find it. How are humans going to react in a situation like this? For example, how you're reacting in a situation, for example, you have an authoritarian regime or you have a war, and it's very destructive, but you're trying to see how you can adjust to it. You can collaborate, you can do this, you can do that. What you're doing if you simply physically cannot live in a place in which you're living? And in my view, this should probably be a different radical questions that we are not, personally I know that I'm not prepared for. I know that in a certain way different type of questions should come. I don't know where they are, but I have the feeling that we normally go for the questions which answers we're ready to provide. But there was two questions I already, two persons who are ready to ask questions. Please, please, and then Lenny,
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to revert to believing in the future that Putin is attacking Ukraine, but otherwise it may be too late. And I just wonder, it seems even obvious that Modri or Xi are simply not there, because Modri said to Putin, it's not the time to make war now, and Xi should believe in the future of China, where even without military activities, I mean hot military activities, he's in South China Sea, but his influence is growing, and Chinese influence is growing in Asia, in Africa, etc., even Latin America. So there is no reason for China, for instance, to be to make war. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make clear, I'm no China apologist in any sense. I'm just trying to sort of make sense and to locate what I see a bit different in their form of governmentality compared to what we see in other countries. It is clear that after this war, I mean, Russia, which was trying to sort of cling to its past glory, will come at best as a client state of China, and the global order is very much organized along these lines. Now, I agree. I think that Putin certainly he started the war because he thinks that he needs to create this, and he needs to resort to this kind of glorified history that he's talking about, so and so years after the victory of the Second World War. And this is something that obviously he needs in order to basically corral support, the sort of support that he needs. Now, as for China, I think that there is still a very important difference, which is tied to what I've been talking about, and then the notion of universality. China thinks and accept science, but it still thinks of the world as China and the rest. This is basically what prevented also China from modernizing and developing the way that it did. Until the 19th century, China is basically leading over the West. But because of the Industrial Revolution and the revolution in science, we have this growth that basically produced the modern world in which we live. So nevertheless, China sees the world as one which we are all in the same boat together. The climate crisis shows it, that we need to sit in the same boat. We don't have to like each other, but we have to be in this boat together. But it nevertheless doesn't think in terms of humanity the way that the United States did, right? The United States thinks in terms of the free world, humanity as such. It intervenes politically in other conflicts, not only to extract oil, maybe to an extent, but to also, correct what they see as a flawed moral system. And this is something that I don't see China intervening in any way. And we even see today with Xi Jinping and Modi they are very dissatisfied with what's going on in the Ukraine right now. And, you know, maybe they're already committed to supporting Putin too much and they cannot lose face, but I don't think it will remain indefinitely. They have a lot to lose from it.
But here's an interesting story. My personal work is very much about the politics of depopulation and demography. And from this point of view, it's interesting to see to what this idea of progress is also not related to certain type of a demographic and economic realities. Because Chinese optimism, and you're absolutely right, from this point of view, let's put it like this, Russia's seeing the time going against them. But Chinese cannot be sure the time is on their side for the reasons that demographically, China is facing a very difficult moment. And secondly, economically, certain type of a Chinese model picked up. They did incredible things, by the way. They did in the last 40 years what nobody has ever done from the point of view of getting people out of poverty. But now they are also going to face the same questions that we are talking about. So the idea of the future is very strange. What is different is that while in the West we all the time talk about the rise of China, there is no such an idiom in China. They're talking about the return of China.
Yeah.
For them, the type of Western dominance was an exceptional period, which is out of a natural story of kind of a China dominating the world. So from this point of view, of course, the relations between future as just return of a certain past is the way. But Lenny was interested also to ask a question here.
Thank you, Ivan, and thank you, ANER. If we can stay on the China question for a second and the return of China, it strikes me that in the West we have an intensive focus these days on neoliberalism and everything that's wrong with neoliberalism as creating sort of market societies. But we haven't looked to any extent at what might be called neo-illiberalism, and what, in fact, China might be able to do in its particular political Leninist context when it comes to climate. Part of the problem, in my estimation, in the West on climate is that we are trying to advance, in this kind of neoliberal way, market mechanisms to forestall climate disaster. And there are all sorts of creative technocratic responses using the market. Whereas in a neo-illiberal state, like China, where markets matter, but the state has the capacity to tame markets in a fashion that much more easily will confront the climate crisis. To my mind, without imputing any apologetics on China to you, ANER, certainly, but do you not feel that the certainty that we seek in a civilizational crisis that the world faces currently can be better contended with by China as a neo-illiberal state?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. And it's a complicated one. I would first of all just say that the experience of the pandemic has shown the limits of liberalism in the West before it did in China, right? I was in China during COVID, and in many ways I was more free than you know, the people in quarantines and lockdowns in other parts of the world, right? So the question of what are the limits of liberalism and where do we sort of say stop, you know, the state intervenes and we still control, you know, what individuals do. This COVID very much revealed the sort of the basic contradictions of liberalism even in the West. Now about your question in terms of Chinese illiberalism, I want to also, about what you said before, this notion of controlling. There is very much pressure from below in China, and this is something that people fail to understand. There's always moments of protest that the system needs to contain. When the people, let's say, take on WeChat, you know, which is the social app in China, they censor it, but they learn from it. They see what people are upset by, and they're going to address it, right? And so one of the reasons why Xi Jinping decided on this Green China initiative was because he now produced a middle class that doesn't want to live in air pollution, right? They don't want to wake up every day. They want to have the quality of life that they want. So this was a way of also, you know, responding to genuine demands that come from below. Now, in terms of the problems of growth and how it relates to illiberalism, I think here is a very interesting question. Because, as I said, liberal and neoliberalism is still found basically obsessed with the notion of GDP growth. We need to have GDP growth in order to have a certain economic progress. Now, China is refusing precisely to take the economic models that we produce in the West, in the World Bank and the IMF, and they want to do it the China way. And they say, for instance, we have this trap, the growth trap. China, you said that they used a lot, you know, in 2 decades ago, the decades after the millennium and until 2010, China used more cement, concrete in 1 decade than the United States did in the entire 20th century. And this was the century that America modernized, I just remind you, yeah? In the 90s, 30% of all the cranes, building cranes in the world were in Shanghai. I mean, we cannot really fathom the sort of leaps and bounds that China has made. Now, we know that there's what we call the growth trap. We have cheap labor, we produce a lot, but then we don't have people to consume it, so we have to export it. This has been the story of China since the 90s with the United States. What later happens, though, is that you want to create a middle class that will consume all those things that you produce and to raise, you know, the quality of life. But then you are basically facing a form of recession. Growth has a cap. And what China has been trying to do is to avoid it. And now we are at the moment where we see whether they will be able to succeed in doing that or not. I mean, whether they can find their own China way of addressing this problem of growth, sure, in their illiberal way, which is nevertheless one that is still attuned to the needs of the people, even if in a very paternalistic way. And there's obviously the other question of what is going to happen in 2 weeks, and this is the conference of the Chinese Politburo, and whether they're going to ratify an extension to Xi Jinping. Because this is where China is on the brink of perhaps going to the Putin route, where we have an authoritarian leader that no longer, you know, serves the people, but thinks about his own political seat. After Mao, the lesson of the Cultural Revolution in China was we need to have a limit, a cap on terms. Like in the United States, you can serve 2 terms. Xi Jinping changed it with also the idea that he just wants to bring Taiwan back, so just hold on a minute, let me be in charge until I solve that problem. But now it's going to be an unprecedented 3rd term, 5 more years, and this is a real sort of crossroad moment in where China is heading.
Thank you very much. We have 2 more questions. I just want to make one point, because of course, this kind of apocalyptic mood is not so new. People who are reading about late 1940s, 1950s, for example, the obsession with the nuclear catastrophe was incredible, because the ultimate weapon was. But there is one major difference between the fear of a nuclear war and the problem of the climate change. In the nuclear war, we're all dying at the same time. It's very universalist. In a certain way, if the Soviets and the Americans decide to clash, that's it. In the climate change, we're not dying at the same moment. Some are going to die before others. Certain type of regions are going to be affected differently. And in my view, this makes the collective action highly problematic. Because this is what I find is extremely important, and this is why people believe that climate change, by the fact that it is a global threat, is going to put us in one boat immediately. It can also push a very different approaches. The only way, basically, to survive is at the cost of others. And for me, and second point is, during the nuclear, for example, if you try to compare the anti-nukes movements in Europe and the climate change movements, anti-nukes was about not allowing government to do something. Don't press the button. Climate is the opposite. You should push them to do certain things. The power to prevent, by the way, has a very strong power on the civil society, right? You can stop governments doing certain things. Pushing governments to do certain things is totally different, because then you should agree on concrete policies, and then basically you're going to have a much broader. So I'm saying this because I see Rainer Muens and one more. So we have 2 questions. So basically, 3. We're going to end up with Tessa because she was great yesterday.
I wanted to remind us that we once had a China moment, and this was during the Middle Ages. When looking back, people thought that everything that happened before the birth of Christ was pre-Christian and didn't matter, was bad because there was this breaking moment in history. And then suddenly some people walk around in the remnants of antiquity and say, gosh, we're living in that kind of houses, but the columns, I don't know, in Rome or Athens are like that. And this is where the word Renaissance was built. I mean, the optimism of that time came from a look into the past saying, we once were great. Apparently this Christian period of the Middle Ages wasn't that great, but the dominance of China and the Arab and Muslim world is not a given. We were first, something like that. This is what the Renaissance is all about. And by looking back, people started to make inventions like, for example, the opera, pretending to reinvent how they imagined that antique plays must have sounded, something like that, I mean, which is not true, as we know. And somehow it turns around. And I just wanted to link this, our own history, to this China moment, because I think we once were, I mean, had a similar narrative about history and what it would tell us about our future. By looking back.
Thank you.
And then we forgot about that, and liberalism is not about Renaissance anymore.
Go back. No, there is. How much time do we have?
5 minutes.
Oh, okay, we have time. You're going to.
Thank you very much. To cut it short, do you think the Lippmann-Dewey controversy can help us in any sense with what you have addressed?
What do you mean?
I mean that Walter Lippmann, in his take on they both agreed mankind was ill-equipped for the age of machines, but Lippmann had a vision that somehow reminds me of what you said regarding the Chinese leadership. So perhaps the answers of the other side, the pragmaticist John Dewey, might be helpful also in countering this.
Thank you. Tessa, Kasia, and we're back to ANER.
Thank you. Just quickly, from all these big thoughts, I wanted to pick up a little thread about what you both said about fascism and the old fascism, which was modernist, and the new fascism that looks like, sometimes like on Red Square on Friday, it looked like a cabaret show, a bad copy or an afterthought. But I wonder if you think that it's also less dangerous because it doesn't have this sort of progressive look to some, modern model of the world or the man. Is it less dangerous or not?
Thank you. And the last question goes for.
So I'd like to come back to this optimism-pessimism question, because we were speaking for years that we are in an age of retrotopias or dystopias, that there's no more progress thinking, no more utopias. And then war in Ukraine came, and when Ukraine lasted for the first 2 weeks, it started to be sort of a source of optimism by proxy. Because, we all fell in love with Zelensky and his khaki t-shirts, so we all repeated what, Snake Island defenders said and so on. We have, pilgrimages of American journalists coming to Ukraine and saying how Ukraine is defending values we are already cynical about and so on and so on. But, at one hand, it's sort of... this confirms this, I think, a dangerous idea that this war which builds character. Secondly, it's way too big of a cost. So do you see any other sources of optimism than, unity in times of war?
Thank you very much. I'm going to leave to ANER to answer all these questions, but Kasia, just to remind you, in the 1970s, there was a term coined by the French political scientist Pierre Asner, because 1970s was a difficult problem both for the East and the West. So he introduced the concept of competitive decadence. Your optimism is coming from the fact how badly the other side is doing. So, please.
Okay, I think that the thread that ties these three questions is ultimately pessimism, optimism, and where are we headed to. I think that this very much has to do with coping with climate disaster. I think that the question with what you said about Lippmann and Dewey, I don't think that they could have fathomed what we're up against. They could not fathom. They were classical modernists in the sense that they see nature as an object. They think that the planet will be there. Yeah, some million years the sun will explode, but until then only us humans can, destroy ourselves. The planet itself cannot destroy. But what we see right now is, philosophically speaking, in the age of the Anthropocene, two kind of forms of thought. You have the Silicon Valley optimists, the technological optimists of like, let's get out of this planet. We might be able to find a technological solution like we did for the hole in the ozone layer. And I think this is untenable, right? This is, in many ways, just for the elites, because most of the people who will be impaired by the climate crisis are precisely the people of Bangladesh and of coastal Africa, which will be, by the way, the vast majority of the population. 5 of the 10 most populated countries by the end of the century will be African countries. And so this solution is unfeasible. On the other hand, you have the post-humanist philosophers, those who come actually also from the sciences, the Donna Haraway, the Annette Singh, or even Bruno Latour, and they say, oh, what did we learn now from the end of humanism? That there was never humanity. There was never reason in humanity. We've never been modern. We need to rethink this divide between nature and culture. We need to cut down men to size. We are like mushrooms. Maybe we have something to learn from them. And this is extremely counterproductive, because there is a very interesting thing. The reason why humanity ingrained itself as a geological agent, to the point that geologists say, this period is called the Anthropocene. This is the age of man, and we trace it back to the Industrial Revolution. It means that humans have engraved themselves as a planetary agent. No other natural organism has done so. And if so, there is a way of, maybe there's still hope. I am not on the optimist side of the Musk and Bezos, who don't care about us and are basically doing, what Arendt said about Eichmann. You are now excluded yourself from humanity, so bye-bye with you. But it's not going to impact us, right? And on the other hand, this, the sort of the gender, post-humanist, anthropological kind of view that is very pessimistic is not so helpful. And now, to regard to your question, whether we should be optimistic, I think that in a sense, yes, this form of authoritarian is not a totalitarian one, like the previous one was. We see it even with the way that social media is being controlled in those countries. So people still have access to information if they want to. The question is, I think that most of how these authoritarian governments, they want to basically take the will from people to explore knowledge. They want to give them a ready-made vision. But if these people will remain active and vigilant, they can still have access to it. And so I think that precisely there is no project of creating or sculpting a new human being. And that means that the violence that comes with the sculpting, what Stalin said, that if you chop trees, you have some wood chips flying around, this will not be, because they are just trying to hold on to something that organizes their sense of security, their sense of certainty. They rely to history without understanding that we are standing on the precipice. Now, the Ukraine, which is obviously like a very repugnant moment in modern history, is the one thing that we can be optimistic about is that, yeah, it brought history back to us. We can no longer stay in this, Steve Jobs, Warren Buffett view of historicity, or feeling that, yeah, we're at the end of history, nothing changes, new models of iPhones, etc. No, geopolitics are here, and the climate crisis is also a geopolitical crisis. And so, yeah, if we are still using these old political forms of the 19th and 20th century of nation states to cope with a problem that impacts all of us as humans, I think that this should be a reminder that there is something that's holding us together, and I think that this is the side that the Ukraine is standing for. So I hope it answers the question.
Thank you very much.